you all. That was tremendously interesting. And I think we're asking ourselves what's changed in a year. And Scott, I was struck listening to your presentation that I now feel familiar with all of those places in Eastern Ukraine. I think I even know how to say Zaporizhzhia now. The risk of correct my pronunciation. But it reminds me of our emeritus colleague, Scott Fast, who used to say, war is how Americans learn geography. And I think it applies to us here in Canada as well. We've got at least 15 minutes for questions. So the floor is open. Yes, there. Go ahead.
I have a question for Sebastian. So you talk about how like there's like a support for Ukrainian refugees. Don't you think that has more to do with like Islamophobia because of like the protests that come out about like Syrian refugees and less to do with Europe's support and the West's support of Ukraine?
I think it has something to do with it. That's what I was mentioning or referring to Eastern Europe. It's like double standards, right? In 2017, we see the creation of barbed wires, patrolling in forests and whatnot. And now we see kind of this openness, this willingness to help these refugees. So I think, yeah, culture, religion, geography, context matters, absolutely. But nevertheless, there is this willingness to accept these peoples. And what I was trying to argue is that we see a shift within the Ukraine westwards. And I think accepting Ukrainians and helping them, integrate them, giving them jobs, opportunities and whatnot, is part of that. Whereas when we look at refugees, say from Syria, Afghanistan and whatnot, it's just a different story. It's different feelings, so to speak. They were housed in different kinds of housings. It was temporary and it was less heartfelt, if you know what I mean. And this really, what I've been witnessing in the news is that the Ukraine is part of Europe. This is just like one instantation, basically, what I was trying to kind of showcase, so to speak. But yeah, I know where you're going with this. When we look at some of the burgeoning political parties in 2017, just Germany alone, there's a new party called the Alternative for Germany, the AfD. Now, how did they recruit voters in the elections? By creating this fear of an Islamization, right? That these people from the Middle East and Africa are coming into Europe and finish off Western civilization. These kinds of discourses are absent right now, and that is a noticeable difference.
Armand?
My question to the panel is basically at the beginning of the war, justification from Putin was basically the denazification of Russia, of Ukraine, and also to make sure that this invasion was justified through the fact that Ukrainians are so similar to Russians as almost one nation. Do you think that the justification a year on is still somewhat the same, or has the justification changed with the changing tides of this conflict?
Sorry, who was that addressed to?
Just the panel. Like
to the panel. Who wants to take that?
Well, I think the justification as far as the Russian government is concerned is still the same. Because they have no choice but to promote that justification simply because it struck a very high chord in Russian national historical memory. They did it in the name of memory of the victory and sacrifice in the Second World War. So without that, they really have no leg to stand on, especially when it comes to middle and older generation. Having said that, the real war aims on the ground actually keep on changing. So there's a difference between the strategies and military operations and the political and ideological justification.
Can I add something? Yeah, I would of course agree, and I think the denazification seems to be more for domestic consumption, because I think Russia understands that the world thinks that's absurd. But and they haven't changed. In 2014, when they invaded and annexed Crimea, a very famous hockey player on Twitter had a sign that said, "Save Ukrainian children from fascism." Alexander Ovechkin, who then worked very hard with Vladimir Putin to make sure he was elected. And this whole fascism or denazification thing is long-standing. It has a long history of questions, including, post-World War II and World War II moments that I think we probably shouldn't get into now, but I think that's all for domestic consumption and the historical memory from World War II in particular. But what is slightly different is that has turned into Ukraine doesn't really exist. It never really existed. And at least for what the research that I do in the line of work I'm in, that's borderline, if not actually genocidal rhetoric to suggest that a people do not exist as such.
There was a question in the back corner.
Yeah, to continue kind of the idea of justification, let's say, Is it still popular within Russia, at least, to believe that it's some sort of just cause? Or is that something that the Russian people are starting to see through 1 year later? Let's say whoever.
I can attempt to start answering this because public opinion polls de facto stopped existing in Russia. They were questioning the validity of those polls before and now especially so. And just think about it, who it reached. What is the sample size of people who are answering this kind of questions? And within those who are afraid to produce a valid answer. So really, there's only anecdotal evidence of how much of a support the government enjoys among the population.
I think I'd just add to that. We did see some cracks when the limited mobilization was announced in the fall. The fact that you had more young Russian men flee Russia than were in fact mobilized. Quite a few more than were actually mobilized, I think was striking. I think we started to see some cracks in the public facade of at least acquiescence from the broader population. And I think that was a warning for Putin's government that was about as far as he can go. That if he needs to step up to actually declaring war and going through a full mobilization and transitioning the Russian economy onto a war footing, that he might have more trouble bringing the Russian public with him. No.
And just quickly to build on that as well, the way the mobilization was conducted, it was deliberately done on a very limited scale in the two capitals, so to say, St. Petersburg and Moscow, knowing that there may be protests or more people escaping to the west or wherever the road was open. And they drew specifically from ethnic minorities around the borderline of the Russian state. And expecting less protests and less resistance there. So they kind of knew what they were launching themselves into through this mobilization. But yeah, the numbers of people who actually left the country was probably a surprise.
Just very quickly too, I think one of the most interesting people to watch going forward, as is often the case, are the wives and mothers of soldiers who have died. And when you saw those cracks, after the mobilization, one of the first things Vladimir Putin did is he went to the mothers of soldiers who had lost their lives. In Argentina, in other countries around the world that have had these military dictatorships and have invested a lot of money into committing atrocities, the mothers and wives of soldiers who have lost their lives end up being this incredibly powerful actor because no state, no matter how brutal, will attack them. And it's very interesting. So it'd be as those numbers rise in casualties, it'd be very interesting what role they play. And they're relatively well organized in Russia as well.
Thank you. Sorry, in the last row in the corner, you had a question, yeah.
Yeah, my question is for Sebastian. So as you suggested that Ukraine is as close as ever to Europe, do you think that if Ukraine continues to get closer to the European Union, how would this impact Russia? Would it not make Russia more hostile towards the West? If so, or if not, how would that impact the likelihood of, the relationship between the West and Russia at large?
Great question. Just sorry to piggyback on the previous question. The term denazification just is going through my head right now. And of course, as a historian, it really reverberates. Really just quickly to add to that question, it's such a loaded term, isn't it? And we have seen the censorship, the control of media and the propaganda in Russia saying we have that right to invade the Ukraine, to denazify that country. It's an evil regime in place, so to speak. And your question was, can they keep up that kind of, facade, so to speak, that kind of myth? In a sense, they can. Why? As I was referring to, now Germany is exporting tanks to the Ukraine. You see where I'm going with this? When was the last time German tanks were in the Ukraine? World War II, when Germany was a fascist state. So they there's this opportunity to distort that information and use it for their own self-interest, so to speak. It's just something quickly I wanted to add to that. It's very fascinating. I was having a conversation with my colleague Chris Leach about this. German tanks now being used in the Ukraine war in Eastern Europe. What's that all about? Again, something completely unprecedented and unforeseeable. Back to your question, super tough one. Historians look into the past, not into the future. Not sure how to answer that. We knew this was coming though, so I appreciate the question. I'm honestly blank. I don't know what's going to happen. what worries me personally is if the impression exists within the Ukraine that Ukraine can make this move towards the West, and then these feelings, these hopes get betrayed, what happens then? And it kind of happened with Turkey 10, 20 years ago when Turkey applied to join the European Union. Hasn't happened, and now there's actually a growing dissonance. There's kind of a growing gap between these two entities, so to speak. So I think Europe has to be very careful in making not false promises and has to be very careful to also uphold its own values and norms. I mean, they say it up front, there's a long way for you guys to come and go through with reforms and whatnot. But time is of the essence, right? The world's happening right now, and Ukrainians worry about the future today and tomorrow, what's going to happen in 20 years, so to speak. But it's such a tough question. Same with NATO, right? How is this conflict going to end? Is Putin going to allow Ukraine to join NATO and the European Union? Impossible to foresee. But one of the keywords I used in my brief presentation was that issue of national self-determination, right? Who is it to say they can or can't do that? It should be up to the Ukrainians, I think, and not someone else.
Lots of questions.
I added a little thing to it. It said, historians look to the past, and then political scientists try to look into the future. So maybe I'll be able to, to say a few words about that. If you look at what Russia has done in the past few days, by deciding to place tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, it clearly shows that their war intentions really is about asserting their power, it's asserting their influence, and making sure that they control Ukraine, and making sure that they put, if you will, the fear in Ukraine to prevent them from joining NATO. Self-determination, yes, absolutely there. Ukraine can decide to apply, both the European Union and join NATO as well. But is that really going to stop Russia from pursuing this? If we want to go by realist analysis and based on how great powers behave, it is not likely that Russia is going to really stop this. Since 2014, it has not given back Crimea, and it doesn't look like where they have taken that territory that they are taking right now, that they are going to give that territory also back to Ukraine. So it looks like going into the future is going to be somehow, as realists have predicted, and as in the end of the Cold War, that will be back into the future. That future is the perpetuation of power politics.
Oh boy, lots of questions. I will come to Adam, and then we'll figure out some other ones. But Adam?
I think this question is for Scott. How are we to interpret, say, the use of ethnic minorities, especially distinct ethnic minorities like the Chechens in the war? How are we supposed to interpret that? Is it propaganda? Is it?
That's a really good question. There have been efforts on the part of the Russian Federation to draw on allied support from supportive leadership in the Chechen region and Chechen raised forces, partly because they provide more combat effective forces than a lot of the other Russian Ministry of Defense forces have been. But also, again, I think it pushes some of the cost of the war away from that center of the Russian political world in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, into the periphery of Russia. Most of the mobilization, in fact, was carefully targeted well away from the major urban centers, so that the costs are being borne by ethnically diverse, often Russians in Eastern Russia and Siberia, not by those closer to the centers of power. And I think the inclusion of Chechen forces speaks both to that and also to search for military effective units to deploy.
There was a question in the middle here, the lady with the red hair. No, you had a question in front of Ashton. No, you didn't. I thought you put your hand up. Okay. This gentleman's been waiting.
For Scott, do you see any parallels between the current war in Ukraine and the Winter War in Finland? Military parallels?
Yeah. I mean, strikingly so. In terms of, for those who don't know, the Winter War in Finland was a Soviet invasion just prior to the German invasion of the Soviet Union early in the Second World War, in which initially, though heavily outmanned Finnish defensive forces managed to really damage and throw back Soviet forces before they returned and broke over the Finns through overwhelming force and not entirely elegant exercising power. I think there was, from the Russian command perspective, a sense that this was not going to be that way. You know, that initial plan of multi-pronged lightning strikes, this was definitely designed and imagined as a surgical quick strike that would be over in days, maybe weeks, not more. And it has evolved into something much more like the Winter War, where you see smaller, more nimble, Ukrainian forces driving back those stalled columns of Russian armor and infantry north of Kyiv and elsewhere in the early stages of the war. Forcing the Russians into grinding almost First World War style tactics in Donbass, and then turning around and launching quite remarkable counterstrikes that are driving Russian forces back sometimes hundreds of kilometers. So yeah, I think there are some interesting parallels. I think the force disparity is not quite as stark as in that particular conflict. Ukraine's actually a much larger military force than we sometimes give them credit for. And frankly, the Russian military has not been that capable at generating and sustaining in the field a massive overbearing number of soldiers.
Yeah, right here.
Thank everyone on the panel and everyone who put up this event. My question is actually regarding, so last week I was just watching something on TV and it was actually the World Curling Championships that were going on. And just happened to be on TV and I was just watching it and all of a sudden the comment, they were talking about how the Russian team is actually not playing this year and they were banned from taking part in it. And it's sort of unfair on the athletes. And you can also say for like other sports as well. Do you think it is justifiable or even fair to like not let these athletes take part in such major events? Because the Russian curling team, I think they're really good because just like in general, it's like you have like other countries like Mexico playing, but a country like Russia, they have like such a great history in like sports and they're not taking part in it. Do you think it's justifiable on like the world, like just like everyone in general for like not letting them take part in such like a major event? Isn't that going to make them more hostile or even like it's going to create like some sort of anger amongst like the fans or like the athletes in general who sacrifice so much? But
Who wants to? We needed your colleague who did the history of sports. Edward, do you want to?
But yes, I'll take a stab at that. It is not only curling. In fact, Abramovich, who is used to own Chelsea Football Club in the UK, has in England, he had to was forced to sell their team. Not only that, but Russia was banned from playing the playoffs during the World Cup. It just ended in the World Cup. And what is also going on is that Euros are going on right now. They are playing the first two matches, and Russia is not part of that, as well. So it has been politics and sports is a very interesting, thing, but a very interesting, area of research. But a colleague of mine, David Black, has a lot of, work that publication on that. One thing I would like to say though, it's about the double standards of using, human rights as a way of, denying these, the Russians from participating in that. Because what might interest you to note is that just as Abramovich was being asked to sell Chelsea Club, you have investors from Saudi Arabia buying Newcastle, which is also a team. I'm not going to go there. If he says something, was also buying that team there. So there is that double standard, there, and it's a very interesting aspect of, of sports commingled with international politics.
Yeah, I would just agree. I've been doing some research now on Alexander Ovechkin and Russian hockey players and Dominik Hasek. I don't know if I'm probably aging myself, but yeah. Dominik Hasek, good legendary goaltender who had a spine like a slinky, but he's called for all Russian hockey players to be banned from the NHL. And I think the problem is on what basis, right? And collective punishment is wrong in general. We at all times need to remember, I think in this context, that Vladimir Putin is not Russia and Russia isn't Vladimir Putin. and the future peace in Russia and any kind of accountability, meaningful accountability for people like Vladimir Putin will primarily come when Russians decide it, not when the International Criminal Court decides it, not when the NHL decides it, not when people force some human rights abusers to sell their soccer teams and not others. So I think I think it's an interesting and important conversation. I think we should all be asking why Alexander Ovechkin's Instagram profile has Vladimir Putin on it. But other than that, I think we should be asking ourselves deeper questions about money, equality, non-discriminatory behavior, and remember once again that collective punishment across the board of a citizenship is wrong, immoral, and in the context of war, is actually also a war crime.
Just quickly, there's a long history of this. There's also clearly a debate going on now about the upcoming Olympics. Whether Russian and Belarusian teams should be allowed to participate. Ukraine has already suggested that they will not boycott the games if they are allowed to participate. Some of the Eastern European countries, Baltic states have indicated they're willing to support that. And there is a debate in Europe around this. There's a long history of political use of the Olympic movement, which the Olympic movement is deeply opposed to and desperately trying to avoid.
Because they never play politics.
But sometimes international politics comes into the Olympics too. Blood on the water polo game between the Hungarians and
Soviets in 56.
Olympics and sushi.
Beijing.
People with ICC arrested.
Don't get me started on the IOC. I have a question here. I've got Ashton and I've got Caleb. Jaden, you've already asked one, so I'll go to you. You'll be the last. We've got four. So that's Jose. Anyone else who really wants to get over a little over time? The deans are fleeing. I think we'll stop there. So go ahead. Here, yes, green shirt.
Yeah, so certain things in the Western media, the fact that Crimea is like majority Russian. And do you think it's fair to like portray everything in like black and white and portray Russia as like the ultimate
Looking at me, look at that.
I'm happy to take that. Okay. And it relates to self-determination. There are rules for self-determination, and not one of them says invade a country where there are people of your ethnicity there, take it over and transfer more people into it, make sure your demographics are on side, and then have a referendum. That's not legal. It should be criminalized. And people who do that kind of thing should be held accountable, but they're not, right? And so if Russians in Crimea had desired prior to the annexation to self-determine and join Russia, I think it would have been a really different conversation. And it would have been a conversation about how you achieve self-determination, which is protected under international law. And they could have joined, theoretically, they could have joined Russia, but there are procedures for doing that. At no time in the history of international relations or international law has been seen as legitimate to achieve self-determination through the use of force and the invasion of another country. So that's the difference, right? And so now I worry about self-determination as a particularly useful lens sometimes because Russians are smart. The government is smart about this. They are changing the demographics of the places that they control so that if in 15 or 20 years, people like me, international lawyers, et cetera, are saying self-determination and a vote is had, they have 70% of the population. What do? Remove them and then bring in more Ukrainians? And then what do it gets so incredibly messy. And this is why it's so important to say at no point during this process did the people of Crimea actually practice self-determination. It does not count as self-determination at point zero. Because if we allow it to happen now, then again, it'll be this mismatch of people like after World War II, when people were moved around and huge refugees flow, victims, xenophobia, etc.
And I just want to
happen in the Kuril Islands next to Japan.
I don't know, but in Japan,
the Kuril Islands.
the islands,
Yeah.
the Kuril Islands. Do you want me to answer that question now? I mean, I'm happy to talk afterwards about self-determination and the procedures of how to achieve it. But I don't know if everybody wants me to talk about the Kuril Islands or other
Maybe
situations.
we let Larissa get in here.
Yeah.
just a quick add to what you've already said in terms of populating these newly annexed states and territories with ethnic Russians. That's not new practice in Soviet playbook. They've done it all around the Soviet Union, where they forcefully moved different categories and this population around the war times, but then deliberately populated, for instance, Kazakhstan with the Russians. And at the time when the Soviet Union fell apart, 40% of Kazakhstan was ethnically Russian. They've done the same in the Baltic republics. And that's the issue that subsequently Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania struggled with while implementing the language laws that were suitable for the European Union to join the European Union. So they have to deal with the needs and linguistic demands of diaspora. So they're doing exactly what they're doing always in Crimea.
And if I may add just a little bit into that, and that is, in terms of international law, I very much agree with what Mark said. But in terms of geopolitics, looking at Russia and what it has, is Russia going to organize a sham of an election or a referendum, if you will, in the eastern part of Russia, where it has annexed and said that they have declared independence, or they are free, independent, state, if you will. But is that really that is a violation of international law, clearly, about self-determination? Because if you look at the creation of states, the creation of modern other states, new states, let's call them that way. In South Sudan, it was supervised through a proper international, through the United Nations, to create that state. But is Russia going to give up those states? Given that what really is an inherent danger of what is going on is those nuclear weapon issue. It kind of changed the dynamics of conflict that we have not seen before, and it doesn't really look like they are voluntarily, perhaps maybe with the overthrow of Putin or with the change of government of Russia, things are going to reverse. We don't know, but as long as Putin is there, it makes it a little bit difficult to see whether there is going to be any move away from this whole annexation of territory of Ukraine.
Ashton.
My question's for Sebastian. We talked a little bit about the idea of collective punishment, and you spoke specifically on the overwhelming acceptance of Ukrainian refugees. What has been the response to Russians fleeing Russia? Like, how does Europe respond to this?
Good question. Just anecdotal evidence, relatively open. Kind of relates to the previous question, right? I don't think we're portraying a black and white picture here, actually. And we'll be looking at the Russian government, and perhaps we vilify the Russian government to some degree as the aggressor of this war. And I think there's an argument to be made, but I don't think we try to vilify the Russian society as in terms of black and white here. I mean, Scott was, and Larissa too mentioned 200,000 to 300,000 victims within Russia itself. These are unnecessary deaths, so to speak, right? Men that were conscripted in the army, often against their will. I can see them as a victim. I would not call myself as a perpetrator or as a bad guy, so to speak. Russians escaping Russia from conscription have been relatively welcomed and openly received. I have pictures in my mind of the demonstrations I showed you early in the presentation, peace protests pro Ukraine and whatnot. There were Russians there as well, and some of them made it quite comical, saying sorry for Putin, sorry I'm Russian. So kind of putting this on the flip side, so to speak, and saying, you know what, I'm Russian, but I'm not Putin. And this, I think, is generally speaking, quite well accepted. I think Europeans, and not just Europeans, of course, Canada, other countries as well, I think are savvy enough to make that distinction, that we're looking at a government here with an ideology in place and a political agenda versus what is the Russian population, 200+ million people who might have a mind of their own. Great question.
I would like to add to that. So I agree with Sebastian that generally the reception has been kind of warm. People recognizing that people are escaping the war and making their new homes, perhaps temporarily. In the countries of so-called near abroad, or how Russia and identifies the former Soviet territories, the reception has been pretty good as well, except for economic factor. Russians are coming in, they're hiking up prices for accommodation, there's less rental market. I know that sounds like a very trivial problem to have, but in the smaller spaces, that is becoming a bigger economic problem. Mongolia is another example where actually the refugees from Russia have been offered jobs, expedited citizenship status and accommodations, and were able to find a place in the workforce legitimately. So Mongolia absolutely is accepting new migrants from both Ukraine and Russia. But I'll give you another example of the reception not so great. Maybe some of you have heard about the famous, one of the most famous established and independent TV stations based on the internet called TV Rain. They've been in existence for over a decade. They've been enjoying millions of followers. They were the station that quit online after Russians introduced this new law about the fake news about the Russian armed forces. If somebody distributes information about the armed forces, which indeed correct and reflects reality, but calls it a war instead of special military operations, that earns a person 15 years in prison or up to 15 years in prison. So that put an end to independent media, and TV Rain resigned publicly on air during their last filming episode. What happened next? They traveled to Georgia because the executive director and the main creative lead in the station hailed from Georgia. So they kind of weathered the storm there, then brought the crew to Latvia and received an official license to broadcast there. As the war went on, they're Russians, maybe they're from Georgian origin or multinational crew, but they're Russian citizens. And it's inescapable. They started to portray events as our soldiers are dying, which is a normal lingo, right? They're talking about the Russian army, it's their army. That's the government who sends them there unlawfully and illegally, but nonetheless, there are young people dying, people of all ages. And immediately, Latvian parliament made a note on that, and the anti-Russian fraction within the parliament said, look, this is a sample of Russian propaganda, and they denied them license. Where this is the prime example of the most independent and liberal-minded TV station in the country. So they shut them down. Last December, they reapplied to open with a license in the Netherlands, and they're now there. And Netherlands said, we don't judge, we don't issue the collective judgment. We know where these people are coming from, what their mandate is, and now they're broadcasting out. So the reception is dual. In some cases, it is good. In some cases, even engaged organization, it's not so friendly.
Just a follow-up question, Scott. I think you said maybe 300,000 refugees from Russia.
Double that.
Double that. And I understand mostly go through Georgia and Turkey, but where are they going after that? What are the receiving
Into the
countries?
stands, for sure. Finland. Georgia. Istanbul, they were getting out through Turkey. That was one of the few places they could fly.
Yeah.
And as far as Bali, actually, there is a massive community of Russians emerging in Bali.
Bali, okay.
Because people work online, tech industry is migrating to warmer places. And hoping to sustain their living there.
Interesting. Okay. Caleb.
Maybe a response to the point on Crimea being ethnically Russian. It's only ethnically Russian because they deported all the Crimean Tatars, I think in 1944, all 200 and something thousand of them. But a question for Akuffo, or Professor Akuffo, the point you're making about realists and realist positions, is this not kind of just thinly veiled, repackaged appeasement? Essentially saying that since the Russians are escalating, they're putting nuclear weapons in Belarus, they're not backing down, that we should essentially acquiesce to their demands, not allow Ukraine in NATO, not allow Ukraine in the EU, because we don't want to give in to them. Is this not the failings of appeasement that we learned in the 30s, that you appease the aggressor and he only gets more aggressive? As we've seen with Russia, that is the case. I mean, they invaded Chechnya twice in the 90s, they invaded Georgia in 2008. They invaded Ukraine now twice in less than a decade. Is it not that we have seen that we are just emboldening the Russians every single time we give in to them? Do we now at some point need to take a stand and say, we are going to allow them into NATO. They will join. They will become a NATO member. They will become an EU member. And if you don't like it, then you can deal with it. And you can escalate as much as you want, but we'll do it as well. And we'll see who blinks first. Is that the logical outcome or perhaps the critique of that realist point of view?
Right. I think that's a very good question. A very good question. But I don't think realists will argue that you have to appease. Realists don't make those claims at all. What they are saying is about the look at how states compete with each other, and the fact that I did mention nuclear weapons, and I said that really is an important thing that really changes the dynamics of this war so much. realists clearly will make the argument that no, it's not like we should, appease, we should just, accept, Russia and to do whatever they want to do. No, it's not that they will not make those claims, at all. But what is important here is to go back to 2003, because these conversations, took place in 2003. That's what I was trying to say, that, nothing really has changed. If you want to look at it from, power politics of, great powers, 2003, we were asking these same, questions that the United States invaded, Iraq into this preemptive war, and the warning that international lawyers, international relations scholars, especially those from the liberal strand, were making is that such a move was really going to set a very bad precedent for world politics. Now, fast forward to 2022, we see another great power, invading another country. In fact, I agree with Mark to some extent that this war really started in 2014. But states do not really change their behavior, that way. But what really realists will say is that, until one finds a way or other states find a way to counter, that strategy of whoever great power, is behaving. For example, new alliances, being built. It is not really going to change that much. And that is why I said that when we look at the way Russia is behaving right now, in fact, Kamala Harris is on the African continent right now. He was in Ghana 2 days ago and yesterday, and he's on the continent right now. The United States issued a new Africa strategy for Africa strategy. In fact, Canada was working on Africa strategy, but my understanding is that it now turned into a framework thing. When I was last talking to some folks, insiders at Ottawa. These things clearly, show the extent to which, this whole conflict or this whole war is playing out in a very interesting way of remaking the Cold War rivalries, that established. Some people have already, in fact, one quick last point, that Henry Kissinger of all time, of all people, have made an argument that great powers should really be more concerned about, creating regional hegemonies. So, and spheres of influence. So that, for example, the United States are not influencing what goes on in Asia. And then you have Saudi Arabia and others, as regional hegemons and, all that. We are not seeing those things. What we rather see is these two great powers of all time, at least of our time, always competing. If anybody should say that this war is just about the Ukrainian-Russia invasion of Ukraine, in fact, clearly has become a proxy war, whether we like it or not, with all the support that is going to Ukraine to try to counter. And that is why realists, will make the argument until we find a way to counter that threat, then clearly Ukraine will continue to hold on to the territory that they have taken.
Zach, and then last question.
I kind of had a question kind of looking forward. I know that's hard to do at this point in time, but at like the pro-Russian outcome, what they want does not happen. And we have a Ukraine victory, whatever that may look like. There's no more conflict. What kind of is the next step for Russia? I've heard reports like they do not have a population size to survive after 2050 because of their declining population. Like, what would be the next steps for the world? International politics.
I'm not sure how far in the future I can extend my thoughts without spontaneously bursting into flame, but one of the things I think that's interesting about where we are now is with the Russian spring offensive largely shot, I think. The indications to me are that Russia can no longer achieve its goals militarily, not without moving to a full-scale war and mobilization of the country. I don't think Putin's going to go there, which is why he's using nuclear posture. Right now, they are in a losing proposition, and I think are likely to get pushed out. I don't think Ukraine can win militarily, at least not its maximum, but Crimea and Donbass. They might be able to clear portions of the south, maybe, and we move to a negotiated settlement. The problem is Putin is so invested in his maximal goals that negotiating anything short of those, I think, is not something he can agree to and survive in power. And therein lies the challenge, is how do we negotiate through that in a way that doesn't deeply destabilize Russia, And, you know, regime change doesn't necessarily mean we get a better option in Russia than, and that's something, you know, it's fine to say, you know, Ukraine can negotiate with whoever it comes after. It doesn't mean whoever comes after is going to have a different perspective or be easier to deal with or more rational in their goals. So in the near term, I think the challenge is how do we exit out of this in a way that doesn't create grounds for escalation? You know, if the Ukraine is highly successful and can drive into Crimea, well, I can see, you know, reoccupying portions of the south of Ukraine. But from a Russian domestic perspective, would there be support, more support, to see that as maybe existential? A lot of Russian domestic audience might not buy, you know, Zaporizhia or Kherson as existential to Russian survival. But I think they've had some years now to reaccommodate to the fact of Crimea being an integral part of Russia. What does that look like? So I there's still a lot of serious question marks in terms of how we navigate the way through. I think Russia cannot win militarily. Now the question is, how do they exit gracefully?
There was an interesting article by Michael Ignatieff a couple of weeks ago in the National Post, and he observed the situation and he said there is divergence of goals emerging here. So how do we imagine this war to end? And he says that the West and Ukraine do not necessarily see the same outcome. The West really deeply desires the war to end. They've injected so much military and economic and other aid into the country's support, and other parliaments are questioning how much is enough. So they want the war to end, but Ukraine wants to win the war. And this is where Russia comes in and point of negotiation between the three sides, really. If Russia sides with the West and says, let's end this war on some kind of concessions, it will come to an end and there will be a negotiation. If it's a war to victory, that would be a very different consequence. So it's really not so, it's a conversation about what Russia wants, but it's also a conversation what the West wants vis-a-vis the victory. A total victory or a partial victory for you?
And if I can add just a quick thing, one country that we haven't mentioned in this conversation within this context of negotiated settlement is China. You know, the Chinese president, Xi was in Russia, was in Kremlin on the 20th of March. You know, the 20th of March actually marked the 20 years of US invasion of Iraq. Very symbolic. He went there for diplomatic, you know, purposes, and they have issued a 12-point, you know, plan to get to stop this war, which is where it's focused on negotiated, you know, settlement. To some extent, is Russia achieving its war aims? Russia really wants a way out. And what I see here is that perhaps the key player, it was Turkey that was playing that leadership role in negotiating a way out of this. That seemed to have been shifted, you know, to China. And China really needs an ally, you know, the way they are going back on the African continent, working with South Africa. What I see here is that China needs an ally. And China doesn't, in my view, want a weakened, you know, Russia. And Russia doesn't also want to weaken itself to the point that it plays second fiddle to China. So what is going to happen, in my view, is that this visit is going to open the doorway for a negotiated settlement, you know, out of this.
Thank you. I would now like to call upon the Vice President of Research, Dr. Gary Fair, to make some closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Hamish and panelists. It's interesting at how I was sitting there, I'm taking my notes, I'm thinking I'm going to do these closing remarks. And then as the questions come forward, there's a lot of people thinking the same way that I am, or have questions about the same sort of issues. And you know, when February 2022 happened and the invasion of Ukraine started, most of us were pretty glad we're sitting here in Canada. We're thinking it's not really going to affect us too much. And maybe some of us were thinking like the Russians, this is going to happen really quickly. You know, because we have this image of Russia being this strong military power. And then after a month, we go, well, maybe it's not going to be so quick. And maybe they're not that strong. And over time, we realize there's a lot of cracks in that Russian infrastructure, in their military model, and it's starting to drag on. So we think about all the suffering that's happened, that we've watched on our screens, we read about, and it's happened without us. But I don't think that we're going to be untouched going forward. And I think it's going to come in ways that's been talked about here on the panel. So Putin wanted to weaken NATO, see some splits come into it, see the EU fight and not support Ukraine, and just the opposite happened. We had 2 new states, Finland and Sweden, put in applications for NATO. The EU started to cooperate even more, even the people on the ground taking in Ukrainian refugees. And so Putin has failed miserably in one of those objectives. But on the other side, we've also seen a strengthening between China and Russia. I called up a friend of mine who's an academic at Delhi University, because I do a lot of work in India. And I said, well, how do you see this Russian-Ukraine conflict? And she says, well, so many of us are talking about why is the West picking on Russia? And so we see this whole, like, almost like a greater divide growing between those who are siding with Russia and those who are siding with Ukraine. And so we talked about maybe a new Cold War or a strengthened Cold War. It's not going to be identical, but I do see this as having an effect on Canada, not just on the price of our natural gas or the price of groceries. I think there's going to be an effect for at least a decade. So we may have been, and me being one of them, thankful that I was sitting here during that invasion, but I do believe the world is going to feel the shaking, regardless of how quickly we come to a negotiated or a military conclusion. This isn't something that's going to end one day, wake up in the morning and say it's all over. So I just want to thank each of the panelists for bringing your expertise, because I am not an expert in any of this. I am a news junkie and a geographer who sees things a little bit differently. And I thank each one of you. I love hearing the questions from the students. It gives me great hope for the future as I listen to the intelligent questions that you're bringing here. So thank you, everyone. And thank you to Politalks, Dr. Akuffo, for organizing this important time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Gary, and it gives me great pleasure to thank a number of people that helped bring about this event this afternoon. So a special thanks to Dr. Mendigo for opening up the session today and giving us the land acknowledgement, and to Dr. Fair for his closing remarks. I'd also like to say at this time, we hope and trust that President McLean is making a full and good recovery. I'd like to thank the Dean's Office, the Dean of Arts, Dr. Sylvie Murray, and the Associate Dean of Arts, Tetsumi Anzai, for continued support to our department and these events. It means a lot to us. I would like to thank the departments involved, the Department of Political Science, obviously, but also the Department of History, which took over this event, which was fantastic, as well as the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Along with those departments, I would like to thank my colleagues, Professor Schwartz and Professor Price, for the assistance that they provided in putting on the event. And as with all of our events, our department assistant, Natasha, has done fantastic work to make sure that this has actually happened. It wouldn't happen without her support. Of course, join with me in thanking all of our presenters who did fantastic presentations, very informative. And most especially, I would like to thank all of you for coming out late on a Wednesday afternoon at the end of term to sit through fairly lengthy, we're 45 minutes over time here. You sat through it all and asked fantastic questions. So thank you very much for making this a great.
And if I may suggest 2 last words, thanking, Dr. Telford, Sue, John, there's some refreshment to do that. So please, let's keep in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, great.
Telling that you want to